Okay, let me start with this graph, kind of summarize what we have discussed. Okay, so this chapter is pretty hairy. Okay, so it's kind of the key to connect what we learned before and what are we going to head to. So the main goal of this chapter and plus this module is trying to understand what causes the fluctuation, or essentially trying to understand what causes the recession, right? So we are going to rest on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Okay? So we came a long way to understand why the aggregate demand is downward slope. So essentially because of the wealth effect and interest rate effect, right? On the other hand, so you have aggregate supply in the short run. But why the aggregate supply in short run is upward slope? Okay, it's because the sticky wage, right? So in the short term, the wage is not flexible, cannot adjust. If there's an inflation, profit is going to rise and the aggregate supply usually is going to increase so that they can get enough profit or they can get more profit, right? So this is in the short run. But in the long run, the price is going to adjust, it's going to reflect, or the wage is going to reflect the price adjust, right? And then in the long run, so the aggregate supply is going to be independent of the price. Or in other words, so the long run, the aggregate supply is going to look at this red line. But I drew this red line on purpose of the equilibrium. And why I do that is because, so if we draw a line like this one, then we are going to in a long run equilibrium. But this is not, you should not take that for granted. Sometimes we are here, or I should say more precisely, sometimes, so this one is on the right-hand side of the long run aggregate supply, or sometimes this one is on the left-hand side. All right. But then so we need to understand what brought us to those different positions. Right? To be precise, let me just write different one to be precise what I mean. What I mean is, so it could be the case like this. So you have supply, you have demand, right? And then so you have so long run is on the right hand side. Or if you have demand supply, and so the long run is like here, right? But then the third case is supply, demand, and then they are exact match with each other, right? So there are a couple of things we need to understand. First, what this means, like say for example here, what this means. Usually this means we are in a recession, right? Because this is what we produce. This is what we potentially can produce. This is number one. Number two, what brought us to here, right? So clearly there are two possibilities, either because of the demand shock or the supply shock. All right. But then, so like I mentioned, so in this class, we focus on demand shock. But why we usually focus on demand shock is because demand shock and the supply shock is going to cause different dynamics or cause different fluctuation in quantity or in real GDP and the price. By looking at historical data, and we find out so the pattern is going to match with a demand shock, or it's going to be pattern is going to be more likely it's going to be a demand shock instead of a supply shock. So that's why we look at demand shock, right? All right. Anyway, good. So now here, this one is just referring we are in the long run equilibrium. What do we actually produce? exactly match with what we can potentially produce, right? Now, the last one, this is usually refers to expansion, but actually we have a name. Okay, so it's come up in the following slide, right? Okay, so in either case, so a couple of things, right? So what brought us here? Now in today's class, we are going to study so how the economy is going to respond. But this response is going to be different in the short run and in the long run. Okay, and from those discussions, and then so clearly we see a role for government intervention. Right, so that's how we proceed. Okay. All right, so now we have seen different shocks, right? So this is a negative demand shock, okay? And then so this can be a positive demand shock, right? Or it's a positive supply shock or a negative demand shock, right? So there are four possible shocks to our economy, where each of them has different implications on the real GDP and the price level, right? And then by looking at those four different types of shocks, so we can spot some patterns. And then so we just bring this pattern, these theoretical patterns, to the actual data, right? And then so we can tell what are the main cause of our economic fluctuation. So that's how we proceed, right? As we just studied earlier, stagflation is pretty nasty. So that's usually caused by a negative supply shock. It happened in 1970. And then right now, so there's a fear. Okay, so this is 1970. First, 1973, this is a war in Middle East. And then, so in 1979, again, so there's an Iranian revolution. So in either case, it pushed the oil price went to a roof in either case. Right, so because like a Mid East and Iran, so they are the main oil exporters, right? But why oil price or why oil matters is because even today, and not to mention 1970. So 1970, oil is just main ingredient for modern industrialized economy. Today, so our reliance on oil is a little bit lower. But back in 1970 is crucial. Just imagine oil price double like we observed or we experienced in earlier this year, right? It's the impact can be tremendous, right? So this is considered as a supply shock. So we experienced that back in 1970. Okay, but the difference between 1970 and today, the main difference is how we respond. Okay, so in 1970s, so the mainstream macroeconomists, even a well-trained macroeconomist back in 1970, they did not know or they did not have the knowledge we have today. So that's the main difference. So the central bank, the Treasury Department, the government, they respond very different back in 1970. Okay, so that is the hope. So we are going to avoid such stagflation. But anyway, so by looking at history, so a negative supply shock can create lots of trouble to our economy, and it's difficult to dealing with. Right? Okay. Right. So we have seen this long-run macro equilibrium, right? So this just cause each other, but don't take this for granted. Okay. So most of the time we are not in this point. Let me repeat, most of the time we are not in this point. And most of the time we are off that point. Okay. But somehow there's a force just drag us back to that point. Okay, so that's it. That's the key sense. But then we need to understand how the force works. Okay, how our economy will drag back to the middle point if we are off that point. There are two steps. First, it's okay, what brought us away from that point? And secondly, so how we are going to return to that point. This is clear. Okay, but hopefully in the long run, so we are here, but we are not always in that perfect sweet spot. Okay. Right. So usually, so we have shocks. Actually, these shocks come very frequently. This is like a weather, right? So are we expecting sunny and the perfect weather every day? No, right? In the Nebraska, so my feeling is probably we have 10 perfect days per year, right? Is that the right amount? 10 perfect days. And other than that, so either too hot, too cold, too windy, too rainy, right? Okay, so similar to our economy. So we have most of the time, so there's shocks, but sometimes we are in a perfect sweet spot. Okay, and in that sense, don't fool by those politicians. Say, okay, so our administration did something, so that's why we are our economy is in a perfect perfect spot. So most of the times they are just they have good law, right? But certainly, so all after we hit by the shot, they can do something, and usually they do differently. So then they can just, and then you can see our economy is going to behave differently, both in the short term and the long run, right? Anyway, so like back to our business. Okay, so we have seen two things, right? Like I said, so we focus on demand shock. So either there's a negative demand shock, okay, and then you can see. So this is, by the way, this is short run equilibrium, right? So this is our long run equilibrium, and clearly we can see. So there's a gap between what do we produce and what we can potentially produce, and we call this recessionary gap. On the other hand, so you can have a positive demand shock, right? Okay, so if this positive demand shock, again, so this is a short run equilibrium. This is a long run equilibrium. All right, so this is very important. Let me repeat. So there are two equilibrium. One is short run, one is long run. Currently, we are in short run equilibrium, and hopefully in the long run, we are going to restore to here. But currently in the short run, there's a gap, and this gap is called inflationary gap. And where the name coming from is because if you look at the short run equilibrium here, the price level is above the long run equilibrium, or above the economy was hit by a positive demand shock. All right. Now we can summarize the positive sides by looking at three definitions. One is recessionary gap. This is when aggregate output is below potential. Okay. The other one is inflationary gap. This is when aggregate output is above potential. And finally, we define the output gap, which is a percentage difference between what you actually produce compared with what you can potentially produce, right? So this is a percentage. Actual GDP versus potential GDP divided by potential GDP times 100, this is normalization. Okay. And for US economy, usually this number is around 1 or 2%. Rarely it goes to 2 digit. It's very rare. Usually it's around 2% or 1 or 2, very small. Now we are ready to understand what happened next. So this is after our economy was hit by a storm. Okay, what happened next? To understand what happened next, we are going to do two steps. Step number one, that's primarily in this chapter. We are going to say, so the government does not exist. One way to say, okay, the government does not exist. Or you can say, okay, so the government just choose a hands-off approach, do nothing. Like back in 1930, right? And then, so from the discussion, we are going to see what is the cause of do nothing. Or the other side of the same coin is we're going to see the rationale why we need a government in this perspective, right? In your micro clause. So there are plenty of reasons why we need a government, right? I think usually, so you need a government to what? To provide some public goods, right? I give you two examples. One, you need the government to provide national defense, right? So this is public good. Does that make sense? On the other hand, so usually we need a government to maintain social order, right? Does that make sense? So those are two examples why we need a government. But certainly, so there's a delicate balance in terms of too big or too small, right? So that's not our discussion. But here, so the way we proceed is, first, I'm going to explain to you how the macroeconomy is going to respond to a storm in the absence of a government. From that discussion, so we can see the benefit of having a government in that perspective. This is not about like national defense or about social order, as I just mentioned 1 minute ago. Okay, so this is different. This just purely say, okay, so if the aggregate economy was hit by a shock, how the government can potentially help us to navigate through the storm, right? And then the next step, actually, that's going to happen in the next module. So we're going to see how exactly the government should respond. But they're going to respond through different instruments, either through monetary policy or through physical policy, or maybe use both at the same time. That's next step. But for now, let's focus on what happened if there's no government response. Right. Let's start with a positive demand shock. So this is what happened right after a positive demand shock. Okay, so we originally are here, and then so we are going to move to here. Right. So now to understand how the economy or how the market is going to respond, we need to identify what happened or what is the current state of the economy, particularly what is the current state in the labor market. Okay, so now to understand that, let's just comparing what we actually produce versus what we potentially produce. And clearly, so we produce more than we can potentially produce. That immediately implies the labor market, the unemployment rate is very, very low. Does that make sense? Because otherwise, how you can produce more than you can potentially produce. It must be the case. So we have hired everyone available on the market. Does it make sense? Okay. If that's the case, that just means the unemployment rate is very low, right? It's very low. If unemployment rate is very low, how the market is going to respond if you give the market enough time? So in the short term, so it's nothing happened, right? Because we are hit by a shock, and then demand is going to balloon, right? In the short term, and the business may not have time to respond. But if you give time for business to respond, and what would happen? How the business is going to respond? By the way, right now, so the current state of the economy is, so everyone is going to try their best to hire so that they can produce, so that they can satisfy the demand. Just think about what happens in the housing market. So essentially, the demand is so huge, everyone wants to get a hold of a house. And then, so how the builder is going to respond, how the real estate agency is going to respond? What do you think? So yes, you're right. So they're going to raise the price for the house, right? But now in terms of labor market, yes, they're going to hire more people. They're going to either hire contractor or laborers to build a new house, or they're going to hire more agents to facilitate the sales, right? If that is the case, what would happen? So this is what happens afterwards, right? So if you give the market enough time to respond. So now if they hire more, but remember the unemployment rate is very low. So this is what they want to do. In order to hire more, what they must to do, what cost they must pay. If the labor market is very tight, so the unemployment rate is very low. Do you think they have to raise the wage or they have to reduce the wage? They have to raise the wage, right? To attract people to work for them. Now, so let me write down. So the wage must rise. Okay, this is as a response of low unemployment rate. But low unemployment rate is a response to positive demand shock. So wage rise, what does that mean to our aggregate economy? So this is going to be a negative supply shock, essentially, right? And then the aggregate supply is going to reduce, right? And then this adjustment will continue until we reach this point. Or in other words, until we reach a new long-run equilibrium. All right, so let me erase everything and then just highlight a few. Sorry, so it doesn't work today. Anyway, so we started with E0, E1. That's where we start. The shock leads us to E2. And what brought us to E2 because of positive demand shock. Now, if you give the market enough time to respond, and then so we're going to move from E2 to E3. And what brought us from E2 to E3 is because the aggregate supply shift. And why the aggregate supply shift is because the market is very tight. It's hard to find workers. And then you must raise the wage. If you raise the wage, everybody else is going to raise the wage. If everybody else raises the wage, and then the aggregate supply must fall. Because it becomes too expensive to hire until we reach E3 and we end up with the new equilibrium. But finally, if you compare E3 to E1, their scenes the same, but their scenes are different. What is the same? So we are going to return to ground zero in terms of production. But their scenes different. And you can see, so the price level permanently rise. So this is what happened if we were hit by a positive demand shock. All right. Also remember, this is without help of the government. Okay. And so to understand the role of the government, so this may not be a perfect example, because from this adjustment, essentially from here to here, it's going to take a while. And there's some problems for the economy, but most of the problem, it seems like it's very mild. So this is not a perfect example to understand the role of government. Okay, so maybe it's better to look at the opposite. So when the economy is hit by a negative demand shock. Okay, and so the argument is almost identical to the previous slide, except we go to the other direction. So we start with here, E1. Now, a negative demand shock will push down the aggregate demand curve. What is a negative demand shock? The example, 2020, COVID-19, so at the beginning. Okay. Now, the economy is going to enter a recession, E2. So the recession has two aspects. Number one, the output or real GDP is less than our potential. This is number one. And then number two, in the labor market, unemployment is going to be very high. Right? It must be the case because we produce less than we can potentially produce, meaning it must be the case we hire less than we potentially can hire. Right? In the worst case scenario, what happened? Just remember in 1929, in the Great Depression, so at some point, unemployment rate is above 20%. Right? Okay, again, so if there's no government or if the government stay away from the economy, how the economy is going to respond itself if we are in the high unemployment state? Again, do you think the wage is going to rise or fall? The wage must fall, right? Because there's so many people desperately looking for a job. They wouldn't, then it must be the case, they're willing to work for lower wage so that they can get the paycheck. If that is the case, what does that mean to the aggregate economy? If the wage falls, and why wage falls? Because there's unemployment. And why there's unemployment? Because so we have a negative demand shock. Okay, so this is a logical change. Now the last part. So if the wage eventually fall, how the economy is going to respond? Anyone? If wage fall, how the economy is going to respond? So if wage fall, why supply will fall? What is the reasoning?
Oh, it will rise.
Will rise, right? It becomes cheaper to hire. They're going to start to expand, right? In some sense, that just means, okay, so economy is kind of recover. Now what happened? So we are going to move to E3. And why we move from E2 to E3 is because, let me write down, wage will fall. And what causes wage to fall is because there was high unemployment. Where did the high unemployment come in from? It's because there is a negative demand shock, and then there was a recession. All right, so this is how we move from E1 to E3. But now, so look at E3. So now we back to the long run equilibrium, or we return to normal in terms of output. But now you can see, so the price level, what happened to the price? The price fall, or there's a deflation, right? So now to help you to understand the role of government, so I'm going to do two steps. Step number one. So the adjustment from E1 to E2 and E2 to E3. So there's a cost to the society. What are the costs? Can anyone tell me? So the adjustment. If you are part of the society, okay? So if we experience from E1 to E2, E2 to 3, what would be the cost you can potentially suffer? What are the costs? Anyone? What are the costs to you if you're part of this economy and the economy just suffer a negative demand shock? Will you suffer from unemployment? Yes, right, because there's this high unemployment. There was high unemployment rate. Even though this is a probability, but still, so there's a probability you're going to suffer. May not be you, but maybe your family or maybe a friend. Does it make sense? This first cause. What are the other causes? Look, so the output is below potential. Meaning, so average, your income is going to fall. The standard of living is going to fall. Right? Just remember what happened in 1929. First, the unemployment rate exceed 20%. That just means it's almost for sure among your family member, there's someone will lose their job. Does it make sense? And the number two, so the GDP fall by 40% or even more. So that just means for us, for ordinary people, your income is going to fall by around 40%. And finally, so this adjustment, yes, okay, in these slides, it just take 2 seconds from E1 to E2, E2 to E3. But in reality, particularly in 1930, does anyone remember how long did it take for us to move from E1 to E2 and E2 to E3? Anyone remember? It took a decade. Okay, so in that sense, that's why John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run, we all dead. So what that means, so we cannot wait for the economy to respond, because this can take a decade. And so during these decades, so everyone is suffering average, and we suffering in a large amount, not like small, right? And then, so from here, you can see, so maybe it's better to let the government to step in. But now that's back to another questions. How the government can help. How the government can help. To understand that, so let me give you a hint. So aggregate demand. So when we derive the aggregate demand, we have an equation. Y equal to C plus I. Right? But actually, the aggregate demand has another important term, which is what? What is another important term we ignore or we assume away when we discuss aggregate demand? So what are the terms in aggregate expenditure when we calculate GDP? Besides C, I, what else we have? You're thinking about net export, but what else? Yes, that is true. But we can count on we cannot count on net export too much in a recession for 2 reasons. First, net export largely was determined or controlled by the rest of the world, right? So this is not domestic policy. Secondly, net export usually is a very small fraction of our total GDP. What is the other terms in this aggregate expenditure when we look at it? Total GDP. Government spending, very good. Government spending. Okay, let's plot G. Now from here, what the government can potentially do? Just imagine magically the government increase spending when we are here. Okay, just imagine for that. But certainly, so we need to discuss how the government can magically increase G. And what is the cost of doing that? Let's just leave that aside for a moment. If the government increase G, what does that mean to aggregate demand? will go up because G is part of aggregate demand. So if you increase G and immediately, so you're going to lift off aggregate demand. All right. So if you can engineer the perfect move, what that means, you can just counterbalance this force. Okay, and you can quickly return to E1. Does that make sense? Okay, so let me summarize. If you understood how the macroeconomics work, and then you can just cleverly design the change in G, so you can just perfectly counteract this negative force. You just move immediately from E2 to E1. So that's in the ideal world, right? Yes.
Theoretically, how long would that take versus the decades?
So that's excellent, almost a perfect question. Okay, theoretically, it just takes a day or a week, theoretically. So how that works? Just imagine 2020. Okay, let's just use 2020 as a perfect example. So first, we understand what brought us from E1 to E3, right? Sorry, E1 to E2, right? It's because so you was forced, either you forced or you voluntary, just saving them, even though there's no government mandate. Okay, I would say so many of us prefer stay at home, right? So that's immediately is a negative demand shock. Does it make sense? All right, so now, so in the theoretical framework, in the perfect world, what the government can do, actually, that's what the government did. So they just give you money, right? So in some sense, we call the helicopter drop money. So this money comes from heaven, okay? So just imagine in the day, the federal government says, okay, so everyone must stay home because of social distancing, except for some of the job doesn't subject to that. If at that night, the government immediately give you, say, for example, let me just make the calculate easier. Give each of us 5,000 US dollars. Okay. So what do you think happens after that? Yes. You're going to spend it, right? So certainly you're going to divert your spending from, say, for example, dining out to others. Actually, that's exactly happens in 2020 because people started looking for computers, gaming consoles, right? And also other things, for example, Netflix, right? But if you look at aggregate, what happens is if you can do that immediately, and then you immediately going to move back. But the structure of the economy is going to change. Let's just talk about that later, all right? To answer that your question. So if the government can do that quickly and then immediately, so you're going to avoid the recession. Actually, indeed, we did avoid the recession in 2020, right? But however, there's a catch. It is two catch. Number one, do you think the president has the power to move that quick? No. Why? Because this money must be approved by Congress, right? Even though the money approved by Congress is going to take time for Treasury to send the money to us. Modern days today is very easy. Just imagine if this happens like 30 or 20 years ago, it's going to take months, right? Because they probably in the old days, they just have office. Everyone need to go to the office, get the cash. Does that make sense? These days, it's very simple. So they just wire the money to your account, right? So this is one catch. The other catch is, so like we just talked about, so the structure of the economy is going to change, right? But this change in structure, meaning so still there are people who's going to lose their job. Still there are people who's not going to willing to spend. Does it make sense? Okay, so in that sense, there are two lessons we learned, right? So number one, so indeed the government has the ability to counterbalance a negative shock. This is number one. Number two, but there's a limit. There's a limit both in terms of how swift the government can respond. And the number two, the other thing is, even though they can swiftly and in a very resolute way, actually that's what happened in 2020. But still, there's impact, and those impact can be very complex. Right? So we need to wait to next chapter, or eventually we need to go to more advanced class to understand those things. But here, so I hope you have a big picture of what's going on. Right? I guess the first order issue is the following. So there's room for government to step in. Doesn't make sense. But certainly how big, right? And furthermore, so maybe there's like unintended consequence. Let's just give you one example, because you probably hear from newspapers or radios or like social medias, someone is arguing, oh, the government just spent too much, and then people become lazy, they don't want to work. Is this something you heard, right? Certainly, this is partly correct, but does that serve as enough argument to argue against the government to move in the first place? At this point, I hope you understand this probably is not the right argument, right? But clearly, if we want to have a complete picture or complete answer to that questions, so we need more advanced economic tools, or you need to factor in many different things, right? Okay, so the final things I want to explain regarding to this diagram is, let's just go back to history and explain to you what happened in 1930. So today, so in this principal clause, it's fairly simple, very straightforward. If there's a negative demand shock, if we have a recession, the first thing we do is the government must provide some accommodation, right? Okay, but in 1930, or more precisely in 1928 and 1929, the president and his advisors has different view. Indeed, what they did is, so they are trying to balance the budget of the government. Or more precisely, what they did is, they did two things. They reduced government spending. They raised tax. Now, I hope you understand what that means to the economy, right? So if they reduce government spending, what that means to aggregate demand? It's going to push to the left-hand side, or you're going to make the recession deeper. This is one. Now, what happens if they raise the tax? What's the impact on consumption and investment? Yes, it goes down, right? So in other words, whatever they did is going to push the recession even deeper. All right. Okay, so and then you may wonder, so what the heck, what's wrong with them? Why they want to reduce government spending and raise tax? It's because they are trying to balance the budget. So this is like think about individual. Okay, so if you have hard time, usually natural response is what? You're tightening your belt, right? And then you're trying to work longer hour to meet medium ends, right? So that's just naturally what we do. So that is actually what the president did back in 1929. All right. So again, so we shouldn't blame too much, because back then, so we don't have this picture. All right. Okay. So very good. I hope you learned something from the discussion. In particular, it's important. Now I'm going to give you 2 minutes. And so I'm asking you this kind of replay what we discussed, right? So in these 2 minutes, so you can with a partner, or you can use you can just do yourself to answer in the following. So the AD and SF says has a self-correcting mechanism. What does this mean? Okay, so you can either try the following. You can try a positive demand shock, negative demand shock. Now, if you dare enough, if you're courage enough, you can try. So what happens if there's a negative supply shock? Will the economy sort of self-response or not? And then hopefully from there you can see. So why I say stagflation is very nasty. All right, I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Okay, so you may need more time. So, but anyway, so you may want to replay these. But essentially, what I want you to understand is the following. So, if we move from E1 to E2, how the economy is going to move to E3? So that's what I'm asking. Or alternatively, like in the previous one. So if the economy move from E1 to E2, how the economy is going to move from E2 to E3 eventually? You understand what happens? What happens for each step? And so, or in other words, you understand what caused the move from E1 to E2, E2 to E3. What are the force is working behind those moves? All right, so those things. So let me know if you need any help. All right, so now let's just move forward. So let's look at a practice question. Suppose the economy is in short run equilibrium. The level of real GDP is less than potential output. So I would rather, so this is a suggestion, I would rather just draw a diagram. So this just means we are here. And furthermore, so you should realize where we start with. We start with here. Now we are here. You can see that, right? Okay. And then why I say that, because like I said earlier, we usually, for this class so far, we focus on demand shock. Right? And clearly, so now we are in a recession. And what happened next? So that's kind of the previous question I asked you to do. So we are in a recession. And the wage must fall if you give the economy enough time, right? Because people are looking for jobs desperately. Okay. So that just means in the long run, nominal wage will fall. So this one, this one, this one. Okay, all of them are correct in the first statement. Now let's see what happened next. So the fall in nominal wage is going to have implications on short run aggregate supply. Okay, so now this narrowed down to A and B, because these are not correct. They are talking about aggregate demand, right? So short run aggregate supply will shift to right because of the nominal wage fall, right? So hence, the only answer is A. Okay, just a rise. Oh yeah, sorry, yeah, shift to right. Thank you. So shift to right. Just a rise usually. So I would recommend you to draw a diagram. That just kind of facilitate your analysis, right? Thank you. So B is correct. Now next one. So similarly, so I would always draw a diagram. Short run aggregate supply is greater than potential output. Okay? And usually this is where we were. Oh, sorry. That's supply. Apology. Oh, this doesn't work today. Now you know this one, the redraw. So this is where we start, right? So now we are here and then we go to this triangle. Again, similarly, so what happens in the labor market? Labor market, so the unemployment rate is low, meaning if you give the market enough time, nominal wage is going to what? Going to rise, right? Nominal wage rise, and then the aggregate supply is going to fall, right? Let's go one by one. Nominal wage will have to adjust upward. So this is correct. Level of employment is very low. It's correct. Jobs are plentiful. That's correct. To reach long-run equilibrium, short-run aggregate supply will shift to left. Why? Because the wage eventually will rise, right? That's also correct. Okay, and then answer E is correct. Okay. Now next one. So use a diagram to illustrate long-run economic growth. Okay. So here, so the long-run economic growth. So where did this coming from? Okay. So what do you think is the main cause of long-run economic growth? What do you think? Do you remember? So what determines what we can potentially produce in the long run? So we talk about the K, we talk about L, K is capital, L is labor, H is human capital. What else? Technology, right? T. Okay. And usually, so the long run economic growth usually coming from technology progress, right? And then so essentially this just means, okay, so if T increase, so first short run aggregate supply is going to shift to the right. Okay. And then this curve is going to shift to the right as well, because you potentially can produce. So essentially, so okay, so this long run economic growth largely coming from technology. So you can see just this is just keep moving. But then clearly you can see, so if technology progress, and then not only we produce more, and the price is going to keep falling. Right? So that's literally, so particularly this is true for technology, like electronics. right? Okay, so this one. Now here, so I'm going to explain this concept, but this is largely kind of reflect what we discussed earlier when I explained to you the role of government, right? So what, oh, by the way, so this just summarizes what we discussed earlier. Most economists think it take a decades or longer for the economy to self-correct itself. And then, so what is stabilization policy? So that's the use of government policy to reduce the severity of recession or to contain the excessive strong expansion. Because in the strong expansion, usually what? Usually there's high inflation. Right? And as we are going to see a little more in the next module, the inflation also brings pain to us. Indeed, so you're already feeling the pain, right? It's inflation. Okay. And so that just gives the justification why we need the government to step in to stabilize the economy, to either just minimize the recession cost or to minimize expansionary costs. All right. So largely we must thank John Maynard Keynes. Okay, so he discovered the secret of how our macroeconomy works, and he offered those solutions. Okay, so this is a quote we have seen earlier. Long run is a misleading guide to current affair. Or in other words, you cannot rely on a 10 years adjustment to dealing with a severe recession. In the long run, we all dead, meaning so we just cannot wait, or we cannot suffer for too long, or it's not a good idea to suffer for 10 years, right? So that's what he mean, and that's why he advocate for government intervention. But that's naturally leads to the discussion we are going to have in the next module. Again, this is the things we have seen earlier, right? So this is what happened in Great Depression. So you can see, so in the worst day, the unemployment rate was 25%. And this lasted for almost a decade. Just look at here. Right. As I said earlier, so the negative supply shock creates a dilemma. Why? So first realize what happens if there's a negative supply shock. So let's just quickly draw a diagram. Maybe use this one. If there's a negative supply shock, we will move to here. Okay, we move from here to here. So if there's a negative supply shock, we are experiencing two things. One, recession, right? Two, inflation. Okay, so there are two things you need dealing with. Now there's a dilemma. If you want to stabilize output, as I just argued earlier, you must increase demand, but this is going to push up the price further. On the other hand, if you want to stabilize price, you must reduce spending, and then so you're going to deepen the recession. Right, so that's a dilemma. Right, so this is very difficult to deal with, and we must strike right balance between stabilized output and a stabilized price. Okay, in history, back in 1980, the central bank they did is they stabilized the price first, and then they stabilized output. Okay, so you have to make a sacrifice, or you need to prioritize. Okay. All right. So I think that's for this chapter, right? And then in the next chapter, we are going to enter the new territory. So it's going to build upon this module to understand the role of government.